So this is one of those texts that we could spend days, weeks, months talking about. And as I spent time with it this week, it felt like it had a little extra something in it for us. And we'll explore that over the next few minutes. So many of you know the name Bishop John Spong of New Jersey. He's written a lot worth spending time with, but he once said that certainty is a vice. Certainty is a vice. And I've always thought of a vice as something like smoking or maybe even coffee. Some would consider this a vice. Something that is not essential, even though I would argue that coffee is essential, especially here in the Pacific Northwest. A vice is something that we enjoy. It's something that helps us cope with the day-to-day parts of our life. And Bishop Spong said that certainty is a vice. And he's saying that certainty, especially when he's talking to us as followers of Jesus, as those in the church, he's saying that certainty is not essential, that it might be a luxury or it might not have a part or a place here. And remember, he's talking to us. He's talking to us as followers of Jesus. Now, that's a challenging thought. After all, isn't certainty what we are after as Christians? As we look at people like Mother Teresa and MLK and Dorothy Day and folks like that, folks we admire or perhaps envy a little bit because of their certitude, I mean, that's what we admire about them, right? They seem to know that the path they're on is God's path. And we look at the things they accomplished, the things they did, and we say to ourselves, how else could they possibly have done what they did? Is that proper grammar? Think, no, yes, no, yes, that'll work. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, I'll have to say. Last night was our first night in the St. Peter's parsonage, and the dogs were very unsettled, and they just paced the whole night. And my hound dog, if you're new here, I have asides all the time, and I apologize for that. But my hound dog discovered that the tree that's in the backyard must be the home of a raccoon. And she's a hound dog. She's bred to notice that. And so many times last night, she poked me with her nose and was all excited, like, come on, let's go look. And I'm like, no. So if I seem a little frazzled, I'll be better next week. But when we look at, people who are heroes of our faith, people who've accomplished a lot, people who've done a lot, I think one of the things we appreciate, we admire about them is their certitude, that they seem to be so sure of their path, and that's what gives them the ability to commit to the actions and to make a difference at such a level. But then we encounter this text today, and this story in Matthew is about the relationship, and maybe even is about the conflict, the battle between certainty and faith. Growing up, I wasn't completely raised in the church. I was baptized as an infant in the United Methodist Church, and we went to church on Sundays when I was little, but then I got involved in soccer, and we would go sporadically, periodically, and then as a young man, I went back to church and started spending more time there and really paying attention to the spiritual side of things. And I realized that I had always thought that the relationship between faith and certainty went like this, that you worked on your faith until you were certain, that faith led to certainty. And that was my thought as a young man, but now I don't think that's the case. So there's a writer, she's passed away, but she was pretty well known in Southern circles, named Doris Betts. If you ever are in a big bookstore, look for her name. Mostly Southern writing and short stories and things like that, but really remarkable. She wrote in one of her books, faith is not synonymous with certainty. Faith, rather, is the decision to keep your eyes open. Faith is not the same as certainty. And faith doesn't even lead to certainty, which, Wish I'd been able to tell my younger self. Faith doesn't lead to certainty. But they are, according to Bishop Spong, according to Miss Betts, in fact, maybe opposite. And so let's enter into this scene and kind of discover why. And I will say that this particular text, this particular story, at least for me, is one of the more like cinematic text we have in the Bible. It is just, it's got boats, it's got stormy seas, it's got a figure appearing that they think is a ghost, it's got big emotions. I mean, for me, when I hear it read, it just conjures up really powerful images, and I hope it does for you. So the disciples were in a boat together, and kind of in an attempt to follow the withdrawing Jesus. We have this story where Jesus is around a crowd of people, he dismisses them, and then he takes some sabbatical time. He steps away for alone time and to pray. And the disciples are out on a lake, a sea, but it's a giant lake, but big enough like the Great Lakes where there's weather systems. And a storm arose and tossed them around for an entire night, right? If you read it carefully, they head out in the evening and they don't see Jesus again until the morning. So the certain safety, the surety of the shore, the solid land is inaccessible to them. The wind was against them, it said, and so they probably paddled and paddled and paddled, whatever, rowed, and they couldn't get to the shore they wanted to get to. So just hold that. And then in the early morning, Jesus came walking toward them, and that's where somebody pipes up and says, "It's a ghost," but they were frightened, as was kind of understandable. But then Peter, who is, kind of always willing and always kind of a little reckless, calls out and said, "Lord, if it is you," which is a funny thing to say because who else would it be? I mean, it's an odd thing to say. But he says, "Command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus says, "Come on." So Peter fixes his eyes on Jesus and begins to walk. And so again, just call this image to mind. He scooches over on the bench or something to the gunwale, which is the side of the boat, and steps over. And then puts another foot over and climbs out of the boat. And the storm was still happening. The water's still pitching and frothing. And we get the sense that at first he's fine, right? Which must have been, an astounding image. Think about, what would you expect of somebody who tries to step out of a boat and then, they would just go bloop. But at first, his eyes are again fixed on Jesus and he takes these steps out. But then something happens. Something draws his attention off Jesus, and we could just imagine like a larger wave than usual, like slapped against his leg or his hip, or the spray shot up and got in his eyes. Something drew his attention away from Jesus, and he quickly, almost immediately, begins to slip beneath the sea. Because apparently none of the fishermen of that day and age knew how to swim. It's just one of the things. So he is on the water, he's walking, and then he loses focus on Jesus and goes under. And Jesus reaches out, grabs hold of Peter, rescues him, and then says this, which is one of those little moments that I think causes us to squirm. He says, "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" And then everyone in the boat, seemingly in unison, says, "Truly, you are the Son of God." There, on the water, in that moment where Peter is about to get distracted by a wave or something, is where we learn about certainty and faith. And we start to see that what we're asked to do as followers of Jesus, as Christians, is not to be certain, but to have faith. And it makes me wonder, again, this is probably a little aside, but how much of the pain and hurt and dysfunction in our world right now is happening because folks are certain of things, that they are sure that they're right, and they are basing actions and policies. That certainty may have a kind of sin attached to it. But we're taught that faith is not walking on water. Faith is walking towards Christ regardless of the terrain, whether it's water or land or whatever. Certainty is being impressed by our own knowledge and our own ability. Certainty is when we are sure that we are right. Faith is when we're sure that God is right. And notice that as long as Peter keeps his eyes and his attention and his focus on Jesus, the ground doesn't matter. Whether it's steady or steep or water or whatever, concrete, it doesn't matter. We're told that as long as his focus is on Jesus and is moving towards it, he can make that walk. But as soon as his attention wavers, and it's hard not to imagine him starting to think something of like, look at what I'm doing, which would be very natural, his attention's on Jesus and he's walking, and then suddenly he's like, whoo. And it'd be really hard not to get really impressed with what you're doing. Right, it'd be like, woo. Or maybe he starts to just notice that the wind is stronger, or felt stronger once he was out of the boat, or the waves were bigger. Something happens where his attention wavers and he gets in trouble. So one of the things about this miracle, this story, that is worth paying attention to, especially for us here today, is that this is really the only miracle that is just for the disciples. All the other miracles involve other people. A little girl needing healing, a leper needing healing, a group of people who have gathered to listen to Jesus and are hungry. This is really the only one that it's just Jesus and the disciples. And so I think that makes us, hopefully we perk up a little bit and say, there's something else going on here. It has special importance for us, the followers of Jesus. I wonder what would have happened if Peter had not sunk beneath the waves. It would have been a better story. It had a better Hallmark movie kind of ending, where he walks out and Jesus keeps saying, come on, and eventually those of us who've had children, or have grandchildren, do you remember when your kiddos were taking the first steps towards the other parent or something, and they're teetering, and are they going to fall, and then they make it to the other parent or somebody, and everyone goes, yay! You get that sense that would have been a better story, where Peter is kind of teetering and makes it to Jesus, and they hug and they dance and rainbows come out, and it's this uplifting story. But that's not the text. The text is much more real. The text is that Peter's attention wavers, his focus wavers, and he slips beneath the waves. And that's our story. It's a real story because Peter doubts. He becomes unsure of what's being asked of him. And that's our story. Each of us becomes unsure. We become uncertain about this life of faith. We look at the world and its value systems and how it works out, and then we look at what Jesus asks us to do and the values which we are asked to live by, and we get a little unsure about it. And does it make sense? And the answer is no, it doesn't make sense. That's part of why it works. We become unsure about this life of faith and this following of Jesus thing because the world is so big, the sea is so big, and we are very small. And we become unsure because we're afraid. Like an ocean in a storm, we just feel battered around. And we feel exposed and vulnerable. And so when Peter slips under the waves, we recognize that feeling. Most of us at times in our lives. And then Jesus rescues Peter, and he says these words, which I think haunt people a little bit. He looks at Peter, and he says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And I think we feel ashamed when we hear that. We feel like he's shaming Peter and subsequently shaming us for when we slip beneath the waves. Like if only we had more faith, if only we weren't distractible. But we're not told what that sentence means. Historically, we've interpreted it as he scolds Peter for not keeping his eyes on Jesus, but that's not exactly what it says. We don't know why he scolds Peter there. And it's just as probable that he scolds Peter like he does, not because Peter sinks, because that's a normal thing. We normally sink when we try to walk on water. But maybe he scolds Peter because Peter cries out to him to save him. Because maybe there was no chance that Jesus wasn't going to save him. That in that moment, Jesus was a little affronted that Peter had to be like, "Help me." It's like, well, of course Jesus was going to help him. We don't know why he says, "O ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" But what we realize with the help of this text in Peter is that the life of faith, the following of Jesus, is not walking in perfect certainty. It's not moving through life in all of our moments knowing exactly who Jesus is, knowing exactly who God is, moving through with grace and compassion in all of our moments. Instead, faith is walking towards and living towards Christ even when we're afraid. Even when things around us are unfamiliar. Even when things around us are frightening. And it's moving forward in the trust that grace will grab us even if we start to sink. God is calling. You can answer that if you need to. It's okay. Maybe it's God. We'll say, this is full of asides today, but this is too good of a story not to share. And then we'll come back to it. I was doing a memorial service about a decade ago, and it was not a fun one. I mean, most memorial services aren't super fun, but this one, the person was younger and had just still had children and things like that, and younger children at home. And it was a difficult moment, and we were having a little quiet time, and somebody had forgotten to silence their phone, and their ringtone was La Cucaracha. And so now, and many of you who've been here for memorial services, I always start with, and let's take a moment to silence our phones, because you don't want to be the person, but it's okay. Is that you? Oh, it's The Office. I was wondering why nobody was like doing this awkward little like, let me turn this off real quick. Oh. Faith is not knowing that we are special. Faith is not knowing that we are able to walk on water. Faith is not thinking that we possess all the answers, knowing the mind and will of God. I wish some politicians would remember that. Faith is knowing that we, like Peter, are imperfect and that we're capable of great things We're capable of great failures. Faith is trusting and hoping that God is good and loving and worth the following. Faith is taking that first and maybe even that second step out of the boat, not caring what the footing looks like as long as it is towards Jesus. I started off by saying this text, this sacred story, seems to have special resonance, at least for me, but I think for us as a faith community. My question for us this morning is, what is our stormy sea? How are we being asked and encouraged to step out of the boat? Is there a path that we are afraid to walk right now? And so as we enter into a time of singing and a time of prayer, we will let that question resonate for us this morning. As we prepare our hearts and minds for prayer, we are going to start off, and I invite you to remain seated. We're going to sing I Want Jesus to Walk With Me. The words will be on screen. I believe it's also in your hymnal. Is it? No, it's not. So the words will be on screen, or if you picked up one of the big bulletins, it's in there. And follow the singers. We'll sing verses 1 through 3, and then we will join in prayer together, and then we will end in song again. So let us sing.